Hey there. I didn't realize how many people walked in behind us. Great to see everyone. Jen has been in the Spatial Information Design Lab this year. Spatial Information Design Lab has been around since about 2004, and it's a multidisciplinary research lab within the architecture school at Columbia University. And we've been doing a lot of interviewing lately. And this person worked in Dan Taeyang Lee, who wouldn't send us a picture of himself, and he's going to be working with us this summer. But at the very end of the interview, he asked us, so what's your position? Both Jen and I are very opinionated people, but particularly me. And I sort of rehearsed what I usually say about the lab, that the lab is situated in an architecture school and it makes networks across the university and within the department, that data is not neutral, that we are ethical and responsible in our use of data, and most often the lab is described as making invisible things visible. All these things over here, which are really at the basis of a lot of the projects if you go to the lab website and look at what we do. But what happened was Jen thought about it for a couple of weeks. She didn't give any of these answers that I was telling to Dan about how great we were. But
yeah, and also when I was thinking about how to frame this talk, that question had stuck in my mind because nobody had asked me that before, like, what is your position? And when I think about position, this came into my mind kind of at 5 a.m. in the morning one morning. And position, I think so many of us have seen this. It's the classical processing particle sketch. It also makes me think of Dan Schiffman. And so a particle always has a position. And people always have a position, right? You have a position, and you and I.
Well, yeah. But following from what we normally, the sort of script that we give of what the lab does, that data is not neutral. Nowadays we're working on data that is really dynamic, and so it really changes the position statement of the lab, saying that a particle is something very specific and brings its own environment to any software that it inhabits. And we're going to elaborate on that later.
Yeah. And what's nice about the idea of a particle is that it doesn't just have a position, right? It also has velocity and acceleration. So you're not just who you are, and the project isn't just what it is. It's also which direction it's going and how it might be changing directions. And then beyond that, we also have interactions, right? So a particle has interactions. What particle system does it belong to? And how is it engaging with other particles? And so I sort of ended up thinking that instead of asking what is your position, a more useful question, especially the way that with the data that we've been working with, is to think about what kind of particle are you, or what kind of particle is the data that you're working with. So where are you starting, right? What is your position? But also where are you heading? How fast? What are the influences on the data and yourself? And what particle systems do you belong to? I like to put literature in when I give a talk, and thinking about particles is something that I've been thinking about for a while, specifically in the sense of being able to show things at scale. So I really like this Italo Calvino quote about ginkgo leaves falling, and trying to distinguish the sensation of each single ginkgo leaf from all the others, and to maintain the individual distinct nature of each particle is how I think of it, while also showing the larger, all the leaves falling from the trees. And Bruno Latour has a related, very related idea, but his is that as we move away from the individual, we end up losing information. So as we aggregate, we get a different kind of information, and if we could, it would be nice to have all the information that each individual has, each data point has, in the aggregate, which we can't quite do. But
okay, so we're going to talk about 4 projects today, and really they're the beginnings of projects that we're working on. You're not going to see them in their completed phase, maybe next year. But the work has all been funded by Thomson Reuters, and the idea is to foster collaboration across massively diverse disciplines at the university who use data at the central piece of their research. So we're working on 4 projects right now, which are, a little messy in their current incarnation. The first is about ships, and it's the ways in which commodities are moving across the ocean. So we all know that commodities and people move much slower than information around the world. But there's really a lot of invisible pathways to open up as things move around the world. And so we're looking at the movement of oil and other kinds of energy around the world. And that's a collaboration actually with Thomson Reuters themselves. The second project is working with the library at Columbia, really as a knowledge network. And that's not just one library, it's all the libraries at Columbia. And we have access to their complete catalog and to snapshots of their use, daily use of various library. And what we're trying to do is think about the different ways in which knowledge can be organized rather than the traditional way of, the Library of Congress telling you how to organize things without necessarily going to the Amazon model. Because actually at the university, there are all kinds of rules about anonymity of, Jen will go into that a little bit later, but we don't want to break, we don't want to break with that that's going on there. The third project, we're collaborating with the journalism school. And also Dennis Tennant in the English department is working with us, and he does a lot of natural language processing. And there's also 2 people in the library who are really spearheading this effort, because it actually took us about 5 months to get the data out of the library. They were very unwilling to do this kind of research, even though the library is such a digital space within the bureaucracy of the university. The third project, we're collaborating with the journalism school and Mark Hansen, who's newly appointed at Columbia. And he has been and it's a project also in collaboration with Penn Global Voices, who protect, international authors with regard to vulnerabilities and censorship across the world. And so we've started a project about Weibo, it's also, again, at the very beginnings, and we'll show you some of that. And the fourth project, which is the very exciting beginning of a collaboration with the newly established Mind and Brain Institute. I don't know, I think it was Zach Lieberman who talked about big new buildings being built on universities. This is one of them, but we think kind of optimistically about it because it really has a radical approach to multidisciplinarity and is going to be in the forefront of a lot of brain sciences. So we were trying to take things like neural networks very seriously rather than as metaphors, and we're going to show you some of that work. So, a lot of our data is still looking like this, and we're at Eyeo, so we don't want to expose you to any of our statistical crunching. And so
what we're doing here is a little bit precarious. It's a little bit vulnerable. We're in the sort of messy middle of what we're working on. And we're going to end up having an exhibition in December in New York. So the end will be then. This is the middle.
Okay. So I think I just really went over these 4 things. So that's what. So this is, that's the library, Weibo.
Stuff about the library.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction to the history of the lab, and also to say that I've just published a book which has a lot of work that people might not know about, but ended up in the establishment of the lab that I started. The first project, which was called Eyeo Museu, was in Barcelona, and I happened to be, I claim it here in front of you all, that I was the first artist who used GPS as the technology became spun off by the military and for civilian use at the same time. That was the very first project I did. I also followed the history of declassification of satellite imagery, and although Google Earth to most people in this audience is such a naturalized way of viewing the Earth and zooming in and zooming out, most people don't know that just 10 years ago, high-resolution satellite imagery was actually classified. The technology itself was classified, and I did a lot of projects which really aimed to track that, and every time something became available to civilian with corona images or Landsat or SPOT or whatever it is, I tracked that and did various installations. And museums at that point were the ones who were funding my work. The last project in the book is $1 million blocks. So you can see embedded in this work is sort of pixels, points, and then in $1 million blocks using GIS, so it was GPS, remote sensing, and GIS. Block by block, we looked at incarceration rather than crime across many cities across the US. This has become sort of the poster project of the lab, and we've been involved in this project for about 10 years. The bright red spots show the highest incarceration, in this case in Brooklyn, New York. These are the lines that connect the home address of incarcerated people to where they're housed upstate New York. When you zoom in on a specific community district, we started quantifying the cost of these, of the basically people being moved in and out of the city over a 3-year period because there's so much recidivism. And these kinds of neighborhoods are usually the poorest and neighborhoods of color across the United States. And the United States has the highest incarceration in the world. We've done all kinds of policy work and related to that issue in community settings and also with the Department of Probation in New York City. Another project which really gets at the kind of political, ethical use of data has to do with this project about remittances, which was also part of a huge collaborative project that we did with Delors, Scafidio, and Renfro, Ben Rubin in the other room, and Mark Hansen, where we showed a mapping project in a 360-degree panorama. But in this case, this was about the migrants who move from a specific country to the United States. So, for example, you can see how many people from Mexico move to the United States and how much money they send back to their home country while they're migrant laborers. And it's very, very small amounts of money, and it's really quantifying a massive informal global economy, which we then, this is how it was displayed in this round format, in the panorama. This is using, for this audience, using processing and OpenGL. And Bobby Pietrusco and Stuart Smith had a lot to do with the visualization. Okay, so those two projects are showed at the last Eyeo in a lot of detail. So now, going back to, as we were talking about, the particle and the system, with Ziga, who has currently just opened a show at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, we've gone further with this project to look at it, so this is different visualization now using D3, where you can click on the various places, but more importantly, you can zoom in on local places and tell stories about these transnational lives, really. So these are a group of people who live actually in Koreatown in LA. It's still called Koreatown, although it has the highest population of people from Oaxaca, who actually have to pay taxes to their home village if they want to go and visit at any time over the summer. So we've been trailing all kinds of things like that, but not only, what people send away from the United States, but also what people leave and bring to the United States, and you could call that a form of cultural remittances. So this is, of course, my favorite since I'm from South Africa. The African market, we sell you food to make you feel good and at home. And this is 137th Street in the Bronx, where a lot of people from Ghana come shopping and send money back to very small farms in Ghana to raise goats, and they actually raise goats in the Bronx too. So that's the sort of the political scope of the lab, is that you can start anywhere on the circle. You can start with people who leave data trails. That data is designed, it has an effect on policy and the built environment, or you can start with data which is designed for policy reasons and has an effect on the built environment and on people, and various ways of thinking about that. So the current project, and the one that I'm working on with Jen right now, really is thinking of the future of, right? So we're using very different kinds of data that I'm familiar with. It's brand new work for the lab, it's brand new work for me. We're thinking about the future of, and that's the mandate of the project. It's called the Advanced Data Visualization Project. I know that's a big title for a group at Eyeo. But that's the name of the project, and it's the future of the university, the library, of visualization, of journalism, of architecture, of science, of neuroscience, computer science. We're not sure we're doing very well at predicting the future, but we're far away, very far along the way of each project.
So we're going to start talking about each one of the new projects we're working on. The first one is, we're working with Thomson Reuters specifically on this one, with data that they have on international shipping. And specifically, we've been looking at energy data because that tends to be what they're interested in. What's interesting about working with shipping data, so it's really, really common to see these flight pattern data visualizations, right? Like this is a common thing that you see all the time. And you don't see shipping as much. Shipping is largely unregulated. And so the Thomson Reuters, like a big part of what they've done is to pull together all these different data sets. And so what we end up with isn't we don't ever have the completeness. We just sort of have what they can get a hold of. So it's very different from other forms of travel. They told us a statistic that I think 30% of what's written on the documents of where ships are going is just totally wrong. So the way that you have to sort of tell where a ship is going, the way to do it is they have GPS signals that go off, but they don't have to have those on all the time. They just, near certain countries, like depending on the country, they have to turn them on, and then they can turn them off when they're in the middle of the ocean. And so basically,
especially when they're in international waters, the rules start changing, and sometimes even ship names change in the middle of a trip.
So we've been trying to find these sort of stories
on the same ship.
We've been trying to find stories on individual ships because they have the same numbers, but the names change over time, and it's just complicated. So what Thomson Reuters is interested in is to do predictive analytics, basically to see when a ship is leaving port based on, who owns that ship and what sort of trajectory it's starting with, where it will end up, and to basically work with energy futures, right? To make a best guess where the ship will deliver. It's interesting, just something that we noticed like right when we were working on this project is that the map projection, the Mercator map projection that we always see was created for ships, for shipping. A quote from it is, "This is the new and augmented description of Earth corrected for the use of sailors." So just super simply, some of the data that we have, this is the GPS signals from 2011 that Thomson Reuters was able to give us. So it's like 11 million points, ship locations. And I like it because it shows a bunch of different things about data. So it shows things that are real in the world. You can see these like detailed paths from Australia to Asia. And then it also shows the sort of messiness in the data. You have these vertical lines that can't possibly be right. And it also shows the traces of data collection and storage, so the human decisions made about data. You can see these sort of lines and kind of very distinct geometric patterns. And so when we first made this, we looked at it and thought, oh, there's something really interesting happening there. And then Thomson Reuters said, no, we just decided we're not interested in that data, so we don't save it. So like in one image, you can see, are we telling a story about the world, or are we telling a story about the way that humans have been engaged with that data? Oh, I was just going back to the quote that I had, that the paths now are relatively the same. We have all this GPS and data collection and everything, but somehow the paths end up being the same. And so it's just, this is like the future has an ancient heart. So the position, we have like each of these ships, and sort of our velocity, like which direction we're trying to take this particular. So Thomson Reuters wants predictive analytics. And what we're interested in is this idea of big data and ethnography, which I personally got interested in when my friend Heather Ford, who's a researcher at Oxford, and I ended up having drinks in the town I was living in like a year and a half ago, and she's an ethnographer, and I was working with data. And we're interested in that idea of scale. A lot of people are interested in this now because it seems like with the tools that we have, we should be able to tell a story from the large, like global shipping scale all the way down to a particular ship, right? And we should be able to say, have that be a coherent story. And so Heather's been working on this, and Kate Crawford has had some nice articles about it lately. And there's a lot of people right now saying we should put together big data and ethnography. Ethnography gives context to big data results, and big data might lead to interesting ideas of who to go talk to and do ethnography with. But I haven't really seen anybody doing visualization or talking about, once we have big data and ethnography put together, how do we communicate that? So basically the idea, so the direction we want to go with this is how do we connect these global patterns over time to very local things. These are the 9 biggest ports in the US in terms of energy coming into the port. And our plan for this is actually to go and do interviews with people who are working at the ports and put those stories together with the larger global picture. It would be interesting if we're doing a ton of analytics, and when we go and do interviews, the folks working at the port sort of already have that knowledge. It would be, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
And
apparently the GPS position of a specific place in a port can tell you what is actually being delivered if you work at the port. So there's a lot of those kinds of stories, because you actually don't know what's in a container. And you don't have to register what's in a container until it reaches the port. And even then, then that's private trucking information. It's not shipping information.
Yeah. So there's just all this knowledge that people have, right, that hasn't been tapped into, and we're going to try and put those together.
And those are the 9 biggest foreign ports bringing oil into the United States. So the patterns have also really changed over time of where and how the oil is moving across the ocean.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the library. So we're also working with the Columbia Library. We have a lot of their data, but as Laura said, there's certain things that we can't get a hold of because of privacy concerns, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I didn't have it here. Libraries are in a huge state of flux right now. The first library with no books is being built in Texas, the first bookless library. And there's a lot of discussion around what libraries are going to be. There's the idea that they're going to turn into resource hubs, not just a place to sort of go and check out books, but resource hubs. And a lot of what's interesting about that is that they, for homeless people and for people without internet, they are already resource hubs, right? So we say, oh, we need to make the library a resource hub, but when people say that, they often mean we need to make the library a resource hub for middle class and upper middle class people, because it is already for a large segment of the population. So and then another thing that libraries are going through right now is actually changing the stacks into other kinds of physical spaces. So the New York Public Library just had a big controversy because they moved a bunch of their books off-site. And the Columbia Library actually has the majority of their books are off-site in New Jersey. So it's that starts to bring up issues of browsing and serendipity. And if the books aren't there, you can find what you're looking for if you know what you're looking for already, but you don't get that same experience of being able to go over and look through the shelf. So that's something that we're going to be working about.
But also just as an architect, I do want to add that I think public libraries are a very important infrastructure of buildings. And although they're changing and that there's a huge controversy of whether or not to keep books or, in the library, as a place, they still have huge importance as a public education hub. So that can change, and what happens inside a library should change. And so there's all kinds of controversies about that.
So I'm just going to quickly give an overview of the kind of data we have. We have MARC records, which are extremely messy to work with, and we have about 8.5 million of them. These are 8.5 million items. It's actually more items, and about 7.5 million of them are books. It's interesting to note that when we have the snapshot data just of one day, about 150,000 items are checked out at one time. So there's 7.5 million, 150,000 checked out at one time, and that hasn't really changed over time. So for me, that brings up maybe the way that we've been thinking about a library has never really been true. Like if there's only 150,000 checked out, maybe the library has always been sort of a repository, especially an academic library, to hold books. So what we do have is building entry data, so people moving. We have website search activity, historical circulation statistics, which are aggregate, and anonymized access logs and the MARC records. But importantly, the data that we don't have is any circulation tied to patrons because of, I don't know how many people are familiar, but part of the Patriot Act was that the government can demand any custodians of records, so like librarians, schools, social work institutions, to turn over their information. So libraries have just stopped keeping any records of what people check out. So we can't connect like what people have out at the same time. There's nothing like that we can do. We've done some work on subjects, just looking at the holdings of the library over,
Yeah, that's an interface that you can go to on the web, and you can see how many books in each category, and we've organized it by the number of books and the number of circulation. And the books in the highest circulation at Columbia are the statistics textbook and the algebra textbook.
Yes, the calculus textbook
books,
has been checked out 3 times as often as the next most often. So again, I was just going to say that maybe the system of an academic library was never really about checking out books. And there's this new space that's opening up. So this is what we're interested in working on. So as more and more books are located off-site, right, in-person browsing becomes impossible. But there's other opportunities created to create new browsing tools that aren't tied to space. So what we're trying to do is connect books that are related thematically that might not necessarily be obviously related to somebody that was cataloging the book. So trying to sort of use the machine and use algorithmic topic modeling to connect books that might not otherwise be connected. And I often think about like math and music and things with pattern. So basically, we're trying to create a serendipity tool for browsing. So Amazon has these tools for browsing, right? And this is specifically what we can't do with the data that we have because we don't have what people have checked out to make those kinds of recommendations. But so we're sort of coming from the perspective of what if our purpose is not to sell? So this works very well for selling books. But what if our purpose is not to sell or circulate books, but to create like actual new connections, to suggest to people something that they might not have thought before? And especially working in academia, like to create new ideas, to by forming new connections, create new ideas. So what we're planning to do is to try and create this sort of multidimensional recommendation space with the text of the books. So we're going to do text mining and make a structural recommendation actually based on the text of the book. So you can go in kind of different directions to get a recommendation. And I think interesting things are going to come of it. Yeah. So whereas there used to be physical space, and we work with space in the lab, right? Now we're sort of going to try and create this knowledge space. The books are moving away, so let's make a knowledge space that people can go into and move around in, and maybe even it could be better in some ways than just looking on the shelf at what's nearby.
Right. So the one thing the library is thinking of is an opt-in system where then people can form social networks around specific subject matters. And then the other way is to use natural language processing to actually look at the content of the book and the descriptors that they have at the top of any catalog entry to decide when we look at some snapshots what books are have relationships with each other. So to come up with a new knowledge category that's more meaningful to users than the Library of Congress, which was really about organizing physical space. Yeah. Okay. And then this project is really the least started in terms of actually, getting data and utilizing it. But since it's working with scientists whose work we are having quite a hard time understanding and really trying to take seriously learning the science of these particular people who are working on these things, what we've done so far is interviewed 12 neuroscientists. And, through that day and few days that we've been interviewing them, we've realized that major advances in science, in brain science in particular, have come from visualization. So this picture here is of the Golgi stain, and it's from 1873, and it's called the Golgi technique. And Mr. Golgi himself did actually not draw this drawing. Somebody named Santiago Ramon Cayal drew these amazing drawings of neural networks and the brain. To show, and this particular drawing here is showing what one neuron looked like. There's actually a really great story about Cayal, whose mother wanted him to be a doctor, and he was really a fantastic artist. And so he eventually, against his will, became a doctor, and what he became most famous for, in memory, are these amazing drawings that he did. And just to show you how that brain science, how little we know about the brain, is that now, that if you look at these two, they look actually quite similar, but this image over here, and it's image plus data at the same time, is made with lighting fluorescence in a sliced up dead brain, and then shining a light on that to show the structure of one particular neuron. Whereas this image over here, the rainbow, is made by one of the scientists at Columbia in 2007, where what you're seeing over here are many neurons with false color. And color in brain imaging thus far has absolutely no relevance. So you don't know what the color means of a brain image. And what they're trying to do is sort the type of neuron through a color system, but they're really very far from being able to do that.
We also have to...
Yeah.
I just wanted to really drive home. sorry. I just wanted to drive home the point that what's really interesting about these neuroscience advances, about these changes in visualization, is that each one of those changes in visualization, which came out because somebody discovered a natural process of staining or dyeing, those changes in visualization is what led to advances in neuroscience. So it's this sort of natural way that visualization has been useful over time.
Yeah, and then the images are actually oftentimes very, very
We also
rhetorical.
have to invest in the best ideas. Every dollar we invested to map the human genome returned $140 to our economy. Every dollar. Today, our scientists are mapping the human brain to unlock the answers to Alzheimer's. They're developing drugs to regenerate damaged organs, devising new materials to make batteries 10 times more powerful. Now is not the time to gut these job-creating investments in science and innovation. Now is the time to reach a level of research and development not seen since the height of the space race. We need to make those investments.
Okay. So we're really putting up that video. You know, a lot of the scientists we talk to are quite suspicious of this particular program by Obama, although a lot of money is going to come to Columbia and other universities around it. But it's really to show that you should not forget at any moment, even when we come back and show you the incredible images that come out of this project next year, that science is very related to policy and what's being allowed to be, you know, what is being funded by the federal government and by corporations on the other side. So
it's
this
now routine
is
in many labs around the world to record activity from even single neurons in the brain, single nerve cells that are involved in deliberation and planning and probabilistic reasoning and even assigning confidence to decisions. And I think that the insights from those kinds of experiments, they are providing kind of a new angle on some of the building blocks of cognitive science, what we were discussing a moment ago. And I think they have some bearing on responsibility, the kinds of things that Alan is thinking about in courts of law and in society.
So what's amazing, this is Mike Shadlin, one of the people that we're going to be working with. I just love how he talks about one neuron being responsible for this and that. But yeah, the thing about courts of law is that fMLR images are now being used in evidence in courts of law. And people are, you know, lawyers are arguing, well, this person didn't do it. His brain did it, or he's not responsible for it. His brain is responsible for it. So there's all these kinds of issues that are coming up in brain science that we really would like to investigate. So this person, Mike Shadlin, looking at one neuron, and it is a monkey, yes. And the monkey was trained for getting rewards for certain things when he or she chose green or red. And so what you see is a lot of activity just as that neuron is about to make a decision. So that's how he can talk about one neuron making a decision by visualizing the activity in the brain. And so a lot of single neuron investigations are just about that kind of activity, just, you know, on, off, on, off, on, off. So
So the work so we went and interviewed these 12 neuroscientists, and the work that we ended up deciding, what we decided to focus on was these 3 different scientists. One was Mike Shadlin, who works basically at the level of one neuron. And then there's Mark Churchland, who works at the level of about 10 to 200 neurons. So from 1 to hundreds. And what these are, if you want to get a little mathy, these are parametric lines advancing in time, and there's intensity on each axis. And each different line represents one experiment, like one of those choice experiments with the monkey that they work with. It's a different kind of experiment than what Mike was working with. And so what's important to note here is that this is really incoherent to look at, right? You look at it and it looks like a mess. You see that there's green and red, so it seems like, so the green is when the monkey gets it right and the red is when it gets it wrong, and it feels like there should be some coherence there. There should, you know, you want it to kind of line up. And so for a long time, people were looking at images like this, and neuroscientists were telling stories about them. And they were actually, you know, there's, in old papers, there's, you know, names for the little, like, strange swirly thing that happens over there. And people were forcing themselves to tell stories about these incoherent plots, right? So then for, what was it?
yeah.
He actually told us that for 5 years, he was like sure that there was a way to, you know, look at this in some projection where it would be coherent. And then somebody came along, you know, some postdoc came along who was better at math than him, and he explained it to him, and the guy just figured it out. But so what we're doing here, so he basically uses, if you're mathy, principal component analysis to take the 200 data points down to 10, to put it into 200 dimensions down to 10 dimensions. And then what he does with that 10-dimensional data is he fixes a very specific projection of the data that ends up looking coherent like this.
Yeah, And in the other half of the project, we're also working with some biologists, with David Benjamin and Daniil Nagy, and it's the same kind of problem. So we as architects, we kept thinking, we really want to understand what multiple dimensions are. What does it mean if something has 40 dimensions? And the scientists will tell you variables, and that each dimension is a variable, and it actually doesn't have to do with physical space. But we really are trying very hard to understand exactly what kind of space that is, because if you showed this to my 12-year-old daughter, she wouldn't understand, she would understand certain colors, but she wouldn't understand what is behind, what is the reasoning behind this science. So we're going to try and experiment with different ways of visualizing these 40 dimensions or 50 dimensions, and maybe not having to reduce it down to as few as 2 dimensions, and to tell a more clear story with that data.
Yeah, and so there's a point to make about this before I move on to the next scientist that we're working with, which is that, so people were telling stories about the kind of incoherent looking data, right? So now he's found this coherence, and now Mark is telling stories about this, but there is this sort of lure of coherence, right, where it looks good, so it must be true, which is questionable. I mean, it could just be a sort of pretty projection that, you can't necessarily tell stories from, which is what Stefano Fusi works at the level of thousands of neurons and takes these huge data sets of neural activity. And he, I think, is a physicist, actually. And he uses equations to think about it. And his idea is that he sort of thinks that Mark's technique is showing a pretty picture that's not actually meaningful. So his thing is that you have to look at this huge number of neurons. That sort of these little monkey tests where you're making a choice, red or green, really don't have anything to do. It's so false that it doesn't really have anything to do with how the brain is actually working normally. So he works at the level of thousands of neurons and has these equations and has a very difficult time communicating that. And so part of what we're going to work on is exactly what Laura said, trying to think about ways that we might be able to help him communicate his research in sort of, we should
wrap up. Yeah.
Roll
Ooh, we're really running out of time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to quickly go over the Weibo project, and I hope Cedric Sam is in the room and you go and listen to his talk later this week, because he actually ended up, through students at Columbia, helping us out a bit on this project. So, but initially it was conceived by, as I said, Penn Voices, and it was called Jumping the Great Firewall. And so what they had discovered was that people who were having their tweets and micro-blogging censored, to get around the censorship around the Great Firewall, they were taking pictures of their tweets, especially when it had sensitive content, and posting it, and it would just take that much longer for the government to find it if they had to, decode it, back into the language. So it's much more focused than the work that Cedric Sam is doing, which is really much larger about Weibo. But the internet in China is policed by something, and I think it's really important to talk about this. In the context of a lot of things that are going on today, known as the Great Firewall, in the name of human and technological program that keeps unacceptable and sensitive content, words and articles about Tiananmen Square, or, for example, off the Chinese internet and from the computers of those who could potentially create a movement inside the country. It is a system of control. Those in China who wish to access blocked websites, including Penn's, must do so with a virtual private network called a VPN. This is known as jumping the Great Firewall. What Penn would like to do is jump in and make their contributions available to people inside of China. So we're going to be working with them. So the significant difference between Weibo and Twitter is that you can insert images directly into the post. So really, that's what I've been telling you about. And so this is one of the things which we haven't managed to translate that, but we're in the process of translating a lot of these posts to try and figure out what the content is. But some of them are really as long as long as that, it's pretty amazing what we've been able to find. And we, over a 2-week period, grabbing 1,000 posts every hour, that means like 100 every 6 minutes. We were able to get, I think, 1,000, I forget, is Dara in the audience? 1,240 that were then deleted. So, okay.
Oh, and I just had noticed this is it's not the same, but it's a similar thing that just happened in the protests in Turkey, where people were, when they wanted to put up more information about Wi-Fi passwords so people could get on the internet, they were also sort of using this larger space to do that. We have no time, so I'm going to go through this really fast. So we're going to do some audience participation here that's going to happen really quickly. We're coming back to particles. And so we are supposed to be thinking about the future, right? We're supposed to be predicting the future, thinking about the future. And I think we have a lot of skepticism about the possibility of that being possible. Very, very well done. Okay.
Possible futures.
The possibility.
Yeah.
So just as a personal, quick personal anecdote, I posted this 710 days ago, actually, when I was coming to my first Eyeo the night before Eyeo started, and I didn't know anyone. And I sort of came here on a hunch, and this is going to be the audience participation, so get ready. I came here on a hunch, I didn't know anyone, and I would never have predicted that 710 days later, so everybody wave who knows me. I would be here talking to an audience of people that are my friends about this work that I'm working on. And for me, I have a whole rant about this sort of the future of, and I always just want to say that the only thing we can say about the future is that we're making it now, that what's important now, if we make what we think is important now, then we'll have the future that we want. And just thinking about what is happening now, I think that the individuals, and this is everything that we're working with, right? It's all at these issues of scale, from one neuron to multidimensional, from a ship to the global trade. And I think that the individual's actions and knowledge are just as important as the aggregates, and the particle is as important as the system. And that's basically where we're coming from.
And we were an all-girl team for this presentation.
Yeah, we had Dare in the audience who helped us enormously.
Yeah.
And
okay.
So thank you to her.
Okay.
And yeah, we're happy to speak at the beginning and looking forward to talking to everybody about these projects and getting ideas.
Yeah, it's the best place at the beginning of the conference. And we're happy to take questions. I don't know if there's time now, but outside, and we're both here for the next 4 days. So.
Get off the stage.
Okay. Thank you.